Welcome to the Rare Sense Podcast. This is Chris Irwin. Today I'm speaking with Brandon Spangler. Brandon is a former U.S. Marine Corps sergeant who served from 1998 to 2003 and now works as a counselor for veterans, first responders, and their families through his private practice, Warrior's Mindset. Before that, he spent 6 years working at the VA as a marriage and family therapist and as a counselor dealing with combat trauma, military sexual trauma, and childhood trauma. He has an associate's degree, a bachelor's in social work, and a master's in clinical social work from Walla Walla University. You can find him via his website, which I'll put a link to in the description, on Instagram at Warriors Mindset LLC, or you can email him, and I'll also put his email address in the description. During our conversation, we discussed the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs quiz, using drugs to cope, the moment you know, letting your heart release, NSDR and Yoga Nidra, connecting your mind and body, the location of neurons and where you feel things, not identifying with your past, emotional regulation, your bucket, the Jenga analogy, therapists as people, journaling, being social, mental health in law enforcement and first responders, moral injury, trauma and storytelling, not watching the news, internalizing messages not directed at us, anger addiction, pushing for self-discovery, and other topics. This was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Brandon's got an incredible story of really transformation, almost living 3 separate lives. And I think it's an important point for all of us that you can do that you can completely change who you are in certain ways. And you don't have to be locked into some identity that you had at some point in your life. Sort of tangentially to that, I realize that I say former Marine Corps sergeant in the intro here. That's what it said on the bio he gave me, but I feel like I'm going to get corrected from Marines out there that it's once a Marine, always a Marine. I'm not actually sure how I'm supposed to say that. And I say that as a veteran. So please enlighten me if there's a better way to say that that's more appropriate. Someone let me know about it. Finally, remember that Rare Sense content is not medical advice, nor does it represent the official position or opinions of any other organization or person. If you require diagnosis or treatment for a mental or physical issue or illness, please seek it from a licensed professional. Now, without further ado, here's Brandon Spangler. All right, Spangler, what's up, dude?
What's going on, man?
How are you?
Doing good, man. Doing good.
So we missed you at the workout this morning.
Yeah, my wife just messaged me. She was like, "Hey, apparently Chris was here, but I didn't know who it was till he was gone." I'm like, it's hard to miss Chris, man.
Well, it's because I cut all my hair off. I'm trying to look more like you. That's
You get there. You got to get a little bit more. You got to front load the hair coming off the top first, and then it gets better.
Yeah. So what do you have some ink? You got some new ink that is preventing you from exercising right now for a little bit?
Yeah, and I didn't know that was a thing. So apparently I can't work out, and I can't do the sauna either, which I'm like super bummed.
Dude.
I know. He's like,
that's
nothing
awful.
for 5 days. So I was like, maybe 3 days. So
what do you get? What's the ink?
So it's a Greek mythology stuff. So, a lot of the Greek characters are a lot of like archetypal stuff, right? So yeah, so just a bunch of.
Oh, all right. We're going to get show and tell here. Nice.
Yeah. So anyways, so I think there's like Athena.
Okay. Go ahead. Which characters are we talking about here?
Yeah. So we got Athena on there, goddess of like wilderness war. The Typhon, which is the original monster of the gods, like the father of all monsters. And then Poseidon, which I like them. And I think we're going to have Persephone. So yeah, a little bit of mix, a little bit of males, a little bit of females, trying to gain some kind of balance.
Why Greek gods? What's the draw there?
Well, I think it's really more the it's the archetype stuff, right?
Okay.
It's really how they're all based on. And there's definitely a lot of different every one of the archetypes isn't like just one specific, right? So it's like this very complicated characters in a lot of ways. So for me, it's like a way to say a bunch of things within a solid period. So
yeah, that's something. I'm not a religious person at all, but that's something I sort of always admired about about those classic polytheistic cultures was their gods were imperfect. They had human like it was like the notion of deities for them had nothing really to do with perfection at all. It was almost just power and ability, right? But all the other stuff, all the flaws, desire, you name it, right? They all had those quote unquote human qualities, which is really interesting, right?
Yep. And then I think at the end, like to add on to that is like potential, right? Like all of those had like different potentials within them as well. So
yeah,
good, the bad, everything in between. So
yeah. Okay. Well, before we go too deep into the rabbit hole of mythology and theology, let's give a quick background on you. A little bit on your military background to the extent you're comfortable talking about that, and then what you do now, which is all about veteran mental health, which is obviously what I'm interested in to a large extent and why I want to talk to you.
Yeah. So I was in the Marine Corps from 98 to 03. I was a sergeant. I was stationed in Okinawa and Camp Pendleton as well. Did some forward deployment stuff when I was in Okinawa. I was just talking about this the other day. I was a corporal when 9/11 hit. So then got promoted shortly after there, and then we boogied out from there. Yeah, that was interesting. My birthday is on September 10th, right? So I was on leave, man, hanging out, flip on the station, and looking for some ESPN, and that was not what I found. So yeah,
jeez,
yeah. So 98 to 03, got out, and then I did a couple years as a military contractor with a company called Bulletproof Securities out of Phoenix. Pretty good little company. And then after that, I guess I should mention when I was in, lost some buddies to suicide afterwards. Really fell off the social boat for about 10 years. Ended up going through treatment myself, inpatient treatment myself. That would have been 2013. Ran into just an amazing counselor, just a super good dude. Had no concept of mental health, like none, really. I was like, hey,
welcome to the club on that one.
Right. And I was like, hey, man, like, what do you do? Because every time I left, I was like, feeling better, man. So, before I got out of inpatient, I was like, hey, man, what do you do? I'd like to do that. Because I was an aircraft mechanic. I was a A&P mechanic for years, and I just hated my job, right? And he's like, oh, I'm a social worker. I'm like, I don't know what that is. And so, anyways, went back into the whole deal. Got my associates, my bachelor's in social work, my master's in clinical social work. And during that time, working with the veteran population at combat centers, veteran combat centers. So I grew up clinically in that kind of arena, working in anything trauma-based, and combat vet centers also work with military sexual trauma. So I've worked with the combat trauma and then the sexual assault as well. So yeah, worked in and around the VA for about 6.5 years. That was my military service. I have a deferred retirement, so I'm out of that now. Spent the last 1.5 years working 2 jobs, building my private practice, and now as of January of 23, went full-time in my private practice, really focusing on veterans and first responders. I'm actually starting to get way deeper into the first responders law enforcement community. I'm setting up some programs for potentially Glacier National Park. I'm already in with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, and then I'm working with Polson to get them a mental health grant. So I kind of spread my wings a little bit, right? So same kind of culture. I mean, you see the same things in law enforcement as you do in the military. So lands us here, man.
Okay, so a bunch of stuff there. First of all, I didn't realize you were in Okinawa. When were you there?
I would have been in Okinawa in 99.
Okay. I think I just missed you, man. I was there kind of right after that, so like early part of my career as well. But we may have crossed paths in Okinawa a long time ago. Obviously,
interesting.
That's interesting. Where were you on?
Fatema.
Okay, different spot then. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I guess getting out of the military then and getting with this social worker, right? What was it about that that was so interesting to you? Right? Like what was going on with you that made that such a draw?
Yeah. So real small background. Like grew up in a really, really difficult family. A lot of, name the gamut of abuse. Are you familiar with like the ACEs score, the Adverse Childhood Experiences scale?
No, go over
Oh
it.
man, that's a really good one to look up. Basically, it's like I think it's like 10 questions of like, hey, like, did you have a parent who physically abused you?
Oh, actually, you know what? I do know what this is. I just didn't know what it was called. But yeah, okay, got it.
Yep. So I score like an 8 out of 10, right? Overachiever. So going into all that,
Congratulations.
I don't want to brag, but
yeah, I don't want to brag, but I got like 80% on this like abused as a child score thing.
So front loading that with going in the military, right? The Marine Corps, which is like, typecast every Marine, right? Going into that as well. So basically through that entire span, like there's just all this really difficult things that are going on. And nobody's talking about thoughts, feelings, what's going on with you. Like there's no like introspection of what was going on with me at all. And I think when I went into treatment and started having some conversations with that social worker, he was asking me some interesting questions. He was asking me things about myself. How do you feel about that? Do you think that was kind of right? Do you think that was wrong? Do you want to do something about it? And in treatment, that was the first time I realized like you could develop skill sets to deal with that. Because as an aside, I got into drugs really, really bad. That was my coping mechanism for about 10 years after I got the Marine Corps. That was my version of dealing with it, right?
Do you mind diving into that a little bit? Just to the extent you're comfortable. I'm just curious about why you went down that road. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in here, like why you went down that road, what you were doing specifically, what you were trying to deal with. Because all of it, what I find so interesting about you is you seem to be someone who got very proactive about your own mental health in a very mature way. Like everything you're talking about is sort of beyond the scope, I think, of where a lot of us go. It's a really forward-thinking mentality, and people are doing it more and more now. But certainly from the time frame you're talking about, to kind of go through that, to be like coping with drugs and alcohol and whatever it may be, and then sort of getting in where you're seeing somebody from a therapy standpoint and really latching onto that. Because there's a lot of people that resist it. There's a lot of people that are like, I'm just going to keep on drinking, right? Like that's kind of their attitude. So, yeah, just keep going. It's just fascinating how you did that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think, when you have all those experiences, when you're having like really difficult, like strong emotional experiences, losing friends, lots of abuse, stuff like that, like, the human body, the human experience, we want to try to do something to alleviate that. And for me, like when I started, because I broke my back and my neck in the Marine Corps. And so, at that time, the military was like, you want all the drugs? And I was like, yes, I do. So for me, when I started taking like opioids and like amphetamines, so I did a lot of meth, a lot of heroin. A lot of people don't actually know that about me, but yeah, no, I was in the deep. So, but really what that did for me is it gave me an internal sense of relief of like, oh, for the next 4 hours, 6 hours, I don't have to deal with like this massive internal buildup of all the guilt, anger, shame. I was a rage monster for years and years. I would feed off it I'd find something to get me going for like 2-3 days, man. I would just grab a hold of that thing and I'd just chew it until it was absolute dust. Right. And so for me, like that was my escape. That was my opportunity when I was kind of, strongly dissociated with those things for me to check out. And that was really what it was about for me. And I didn't know that at the time, right? I just like, oh, I feel good. This is great. I didn't realize like that was the balance that was happening internally. And then, so when before I went into treatment, this is worth saying, I think. So I was dating this girl. I was working at the airport. She worked in the nuclear field. We were making great money. We had a couple cars. We had a couple houses we were renting out. We were doing really, really well. But I was using drugs at that time at like an absolute maniac. And I remember thinking like, I have all the things and the stuff, right? I have the house. We got the dog. We're renting out apartments, houses. But I'm still, my drug use is still continuing to ramp and ramp and ramp. And man, God bless this man. Her father basically came to the house one time after they realized like, oh, you're using like drugs. He came to the house. He's like, hey man, you got to go. And he was super good dude. Said it with love, said it with affection. He's like, hey man, I'll help you out. I will do whatever you need me to do to get you into treatment center, but you can't do this to my daughter and you got to go. And I was like, oh, that's what a man looks like, right? Like you can be firm and fair, but compassionate. And for me, I was like, oh, and I had a ton of respect for him. He's and continues to be an amazing man. So for me, I was like, all right. And he did. He ended up calling like, I was in Oregon at the time. So Eastern Oregon, he called Boise and then he called Walla Walla. Walla Walla called me back sooner and he's like, hey, there you go. Like pack your shit in the back of your truck and give her good, man. Give her hell. And so, yeah, so that's what I ended up doing. I was homeless for about 3 months because they didn't have a bed that was open. So I was living in the back of my truck, like way in the mountains, because I'm a country kid by heart. So it didn't terribly bother me, but I was like in the mountains. And I'd come back into town every couple of days and charge my phone and be like, hey, you guys got a seat yet? Nope. All right. Okay, head back out, man. Did that for about 2.5 months. And then the last 2 weeks, I got into a homeless shelter because I wasn't showering. The whole deal, right? Like it was pretty rough. So I went into a place called the Christian Aid Center in Walla Walla, which I ended up doing an internship there later on as like a thank you to them. Mm-hmm. So when I got to that point in my life, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this. I was really at a crossroads, man. You know, again, I've had a bunch of buddies die. A bunch of them were getting killed or dying by suicide. My best friend died, Brian Lenning. And I was really at the like, hey man, like this is either a shit or get off the pot for me. I'm either gonna go the final route and put one in myself and bite the bullet literally, or I'm gonna go all in. And I was like, well, I'm gonna decide to go all in. But if I go all in, like I'm gonna milk this thing until it's done. And if I can get something out of it, I'll get it. But I'm gonna give it like an absolute solid shot, and I'm gonna run it through. And I think that's why when I was talking to my counselor, and they were saying like, hey, like this, you can try this, and the first time I ever tried meditation, they're like, oh, you can sit down and meditate. And I was like, well, that sounds really dumb, but I'm gonna give that a shot too, right?
Yeah.
But I was open, man. I was so internally distraught that I was like, I've got to do something, right? And if I'm gonna do this thing, like I'm gonna do it 100%, and we're gonna run it until the wheels fall off. And if it falls off, then at least I know I tried. But
can I ask you, in that moment when you were sort of like you said, shit or get off the pot here, was it you were distraught still over the things you had been trying to use, drugs, alcohol, whatever, to cope with? Or were you distraught over what you had succumbed to in terms of using those things? Or was it a combination of both of those things?
I think it was a combination of both. So like every good person who's wrapped up in addiction, I tried, dozens of times to stop because I was like, I don't really necessarily want to do this, right? But then it was also like all of the events that had happened to me over the years, or happened to me over the years, and I just didn't know what to do with them, right? And there's just like, dude, I have all these experiences and all that. Like it was just such an internal heavy weight. So it was that, and then using the drugs to cope with that. It was just like, dude, like, where's my life going? I'm 30 or early 30s, right? And like, drug addiction, like massive issues with like chronic pain from my neck and my lower back, not being successful in any measurable way of my life. And so it was really like this amalgamation of all these experiences, the drug use and all the other trauma in the background.
And so what was the process then, right? Like how did you shake those things? It's so interesting to me because like I know you as hard charging athlete in our gym. That's how we met, right? At Big Mountain CrossFit. And, one of the best athletes in the gym, like one of the nicest people I know, always a smile on your face, laughing, and somebody who helps other people, right? That's how, and very clean too, right? Like doesn't drink and doesn't and that's how I know you. That's how I met you. And you have seemingly at least 2 other complete lives behind you. One is as a military, as a Marine, and then one is kind of like downward spiral, kind of, right? And for me, there's a couple things there. One is I think it's super inspiring because I think there's a lot of people that feel like they're tied to whatever, especially military people, veterans feel like they're tied to their military career. They can't go do something else, right? So like really challenging, they lose their purpose, that kind of thing. And that's something I talk about a lot. You're clearly a case where that's not true. You can go do something else. Two, you can pull yourself out of the depths, right? Like you can descend into, let's stick with Greek mythology here, into the pit of Hades, right? Like the bottom, the river Styx or whatever, the Stygian nightmare, as it were, and you can get out of that, and you can do it seemingly. I don't know. You can kind of talk about like how that all went for you, but potentially through a lot of your own power, right? Not necessarily through. I mean, it's great. Other people help you along the way, certainly, but like you have the ability to do that, which I think is so important for people to hear too. So talk about how that went for you, right? Like how you finally got clean, so to speak, and then how all this mental training came into play for you, and what really moved the needle too. That's what I'm curious about too. Like, did you have started meditating and like, holy shit, I can't believe what this is doing for me? Was it something else?
Yeah. So there was like this eureka aha moment that I had in when I was in treatment, and then I had to actually do the work afterwards, but I had the moment, right? So, I'm sure you've never been an inpatient, but for the people who've been an inpatient, like, a couple times a week, at least in Walla Walla, what they would do is they would have like these group presentations and educations, right? Of like, like family dynamics and trauma and drug use and all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And there's this counselor there. She was this really just super old, nice lady. And she's going through and she's talking about family dynamics, family role systems and all this stuff. And like, when you're talking about like, name your trauma, like the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, she's just checking all the boxes for me, right? And I'm just like, check, check, check. And I remember about 3/4 of the way through it, I raised my hand and she says, yeah. I said, all right, I get all this. And I go, I'm checking the boxes and that's great. I go, but at what point is this, like, at what point am I responsible for taking care of this? And she goes, the minute you know. And that hit me like a fucking ton of bricks, dude. Boom. And I was like, oh, right. Because now I was getting this knowledge of like, hey, it's not normal for you to get beat by a hose and all the stuff, right? I had no context for that. So, and all these different versions of what was these traumatic things. And she was talking about like, like, hey, there's these skills you can learn, whether it's like breath work, meditation, working out, like there's all these things you can learn. I had no idea that there's like this giant tool bag that you can start dipping your fingers into and be like, oh, I can use that for that, or I can use that for that. And that was that eureka moment for me. Like, oh, you can do something about this. Like I had a very, fatalistic, nihilistic view of like, oh, well, I'm, this is my life. It's super crazy and I'm going to run it into the ground until it explodes. And then good game. Right. I realized like, oh, I can actually do something with that. So for me, that was that moment of, oh, okay, now I can actually try to do some of these things. And what that really did, Chris, was it gave me hope. And that was the trigger for me, like, oh, I can do something about this and I can actually develop some skill sets in some way. And so for me, I was like, oh shit. All right. Well, let's see what these are. And yeah, and Walla Walla was really good about, they had the regular individual therapy, group therapy, education, but they had a program called the CAM program, complementary and alternative medicines. And that was like Tai Chi and yoga and breath work and guided meditations. And I'll tell you this is an interesting one. So very first time I ever meditated, they had this little dark room, really nice recliners that sit all the way back, right? I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I just want to go in here and sleep because I'm tired. I put these headphones on and I'm like, all right, let's do this thing, man. I have no idea what to expect. I don't know if they're going to yell at me or I have no idea, right? This really nice lady voice comes on and she's going on for like 5 or 10 minutes. And I actually have never told anybody this. So I remember having like a lightness that kind of came over me as I'm going through this guided meditation and I'm seeing this in my mind's eye. And she talked about like, okay, now feel your heart, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay. And she's like, let your heart just release a little bit. And I had this, and I still have it to this day. I have this like this mental image of having like my heart like wrapped in barbed wire, right? And like the barbed wire just like relented a little bit. And I was like, I remember just taking like this big gasping breath of air and being like, whoa. And I was like, that was crazy. And, I finished up the meditation for a couple more minutes, walking back to the other side of campus. And my brain at that point, that was the first time my brain and body were like at complete like homeostasis and relaxing. And I was like, what is this? I was a little bit freaked out, man. I was like, okay, I feel like that's where we're supposed to be, but this is strange. So that's when I knew like there's something here. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's something, because I know my internals, and that wasn't anywhere near my normal baseline.
That's awesome. I think that's something that, do you ever do Yoga Nidra or NSDR, like Andrew Huberman's non-sleep deep rest? Do you know what I'm talking about, those two practices?
I do know what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. So for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what this is, Yoga Nidra it's not yoga in the traditional way you would think of it, where you're moving in downward dog and that type of stuff. You're basically sort of like scanning your body and connecting your mind with your body, and you're going through your various body parts. So you might start with your head, and it's very specific. It goes from like forehead, behind your eyes, and you're just kind of like connecting that idea, like connecting your mind with that part of your body, and trying to relax it as well. So it's like go to your tongue and like the back of your tongue and relax it in your throat. And it's a really effective practice for nervous system downregulation. And Andrew Huberman's got a thing called non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, which is essentially the same thing. And it can be 10 minutes, as short as 10 minutes. It's really effective. I really like it. It's something I kind of figured out how to do on my own. Actually, it's funny. I came across this practice recently, I would say within the last year. And I was like, I actually came up with that on my own, like as a kid almost, when I used to have trouble sleeping. I was like, well, I'm just like too amped up. So I'm going to go scan my body and try to relax various muscle groups, like get them to relax to the point where they feel like they're sinking into the bed. And I would just, after 10 minutes of that, I would fall asleep. And it's funny, it took me a while of doing NSDR to be like, hey, I figured out how to do this on my own like 30 years ago. But it's the same kind of thing you're talking about, which is really, I think our minds and our bodies, even though obviously they're still working together, so to speak, they become disconnected in certain ways where you're not really tapping into that ability of like, you can consciously direct your attention to various parts of your body and have a physiological impact on them. And that's kind of what you're talking about. And I love that idea. I'm going to try this now, this like relax your heart, release some of that around your heart. And we talk about, I just want to pause on this concept for a second. We talk about our heart. People use that as a metaphor for feelings, right? Like our emotional center, whatever you want to call it, of our heart, which is kind of weird. If you're a really logical person like me, you kind of go, that's bullshit, right? Now, granted, like the ancient Egyptians basically thought that was the center of the being. They thought the brain was just mush. They like hacked it out when people died, right? They just pulled it out through their nose. But the heart was really important. They would embalm that and wrap it, mummify your heart. But we know now that there's neurons in your heart, right? Like there are neurons in your stomach. So these things that we think of as being, I don't know what you want to call it, like thinking parts of what make us conscious, neurons, right? Like that are in our brains. They're in other parts of your body too. And realizing that can kind of make you think, maybe it isn't all just about my brain when it comes to what makes me me. And thinking about where emotions get stored, which I'm a big proponent of and a big believer in, that's really important. So that's cool, man, that you had that kind of epiphany with that practice.
Yeah, it really was weird, man. Like I had, it's one of those things like you don't really know what you don't know, and then when you have like this experience, it's just such a one-off from what your regular life is like. Those can be profound and impactful, right? So much so that I'm talking about it, 10 years later, that it was one of my very first like very strong internal experiences. But yeah, I think those experiences are good to have. I was going to do like an add-on to when you're talking about like the Egyptians. I think, when you talk about like Socrates and Plato's, like those guys, they talked about the gut being the second brain.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yep.
So, until recently, everybody's like, oh, that's just horse rubbish. Right. The medical community in general is like, that's bullshit. Like, well, it turns out, right, we have all those neurons there. We have mirror neurons that help us mirror other people as well, right? Like,
yep.
Yeah, there's so much more going on that I don't think the regular, I would say the medical profession in general isn't really privy on, right? So
for sure.
And I think when you're talking about trying to expand your mental health and what that looks like to like navigate the world better, I think the movement that we're having over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years has been extraordinarily helpful because there's so many like individual people like yourself and other people who are like, hey, I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to try some of these things. And we're going to see what happens, right? We're going to see what happens when I do this and what happens. And yeah, it's a lot of N of one, right? A lot of anecdotal stuff, but the collective consciousness that's happening around that is pretty interesting. And it's kind of developing, I would say, strongly outside like the traditional medical community, even though I think the medical community is like, oh, there may be some things to this now, right?
Yeah. Finally.
Right.
Those Chinese that came up with that acupuncture stuff like 3,000 years ago, people are still doing like, yeah, there might be something to that. Oh, you think?
Right. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll call it like battlefield acupuncture, right?
Right. Well, you'll change the name. Yeah. So, yeah.
Right. It's ours.
So we can patent it and make money off of it.
Hey, did you guys see this thing we came up with?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Pfizer.
Brought to you by Pfizer. Yeah.
But I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit on that. But yeah, I just think that I talk a lot about kind of releasing emotional energy, right? Like the need to cry, the need to laugh, the need to be angry to some extent in a healthy way, like not where you're throwing plates on the wall or being violent with somebody, but figuring out why you feel that way and that's the important thing. It's like digging into that, like, why are you so angry, right? Really understand that. But it's not just that, it is feeling yourself, like not in a creepy way, but like meaning like something like meditation, scanning your body and be like, if you're angry or you're sad, where do you feel that in your body? It's not just like, that's an important component of it. It's not just, I feel sad. Okay, got it. Where? Like, where do you feel that? Because as much as this is something I never thought was real, that emotional energy gets stored places. And I always tell people that are sort of like, what, really? Like I'm like, okay, well, if you don't think energy can be stored in you, what do you think a memory is, right? We were talking about this the other day.
100%.
Okay? Like we all understand that memory is a thing. That's an experience you had that was, right? That's no longer present, really, the actual experience. It somehow got imprinted upon your cells in your brain, as far as we know, for the most part. But then you can bring it back out, right? So that the energy of that, the information from that experience is stored in your body, right? So if that can happen, who's to say that a really traumatic experience can't get stored in you in other ways too, especially if we have neurons in other parts of our body, right? Who's to say that it's only in your brain and that it has no impact on you, right? Like I firmly believe it can get stored in other places and can cause dysfunction. And so that's why it's so important as we process these things. And I'm sure you deal with this with the veterans you deal with and first responders, like feel it. Like, where do you feel that? And then what's your relationship with that feeling? Is it something you hate? Is it something you try to push away? Are you figuring out a way to embrace it? Right? These are all things that I think are really important practices that people need to open their eyes to.
Yeah, and like we were talking about just a minute ago, like that's that divergence from the regular medical community, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of people that go the woo woo, but I can tell you, I've sat in front of thousands of people so far in my career, and I'm a strictly a trauma based therapist, right? Like I don't work with the worried well. Like that's cool. Somebody else can have that. Like I want to go into the deep, right? I'm familiar with it. I'm comfortable with it. And so like one of the interesting things is like when you start talking to people about I'll do different like evidence based stuff, and when we start talking about some of the traumas, it's been interesting, man. So I had like a guy who watched another human being's neck get broke, and as we were going, yeah, it's not great.
Oh.
So yeah, well, it's one of 1,000, right? So when he was going through and we were processing through that stuff, like a couple weeks later, he started developing some really bad, well, he'd had bad neck issues in the past, but it started getting significantly worse.
Yeah. Right.
When you hear people start talking about some other, I don't want to give too many more like stories, but that was just like an acute example. But you'll have people start talking about, walking across minefields, and then their legs will literally start twitching.
Yeah.
They can't move. You know what I mean? So that connection is 100% there. For me, that's not even like it's possible. Like I see it daily, right?
Yes, good.
I mean, it absolutely is a fact. It is stored in the body. And one of the interesting things, and I know you've kind of poked around with this a little bit too, of like, hey man, like if we're going through something, we're processing something, and I'll see a leg twitching, or I'll see the arm moving, or the shoulders. Like, hey man, where are you feeling that in your body right now? Oh, I'm feeling it right here and right here. Let's stretch that out a little bit. Let's move it a little bit. See if we can get that stuff going a little bit, right?
Yep.
So do something to kind of exercise, quote unquote, some of that trauma out of there, and trying to get some of that stuff out of there, because that stuff is super real. I will also say, when you're talking about like kind of sitting with things, and where does that kind of sit in the body, like emotionally, I had this really cool chart that I started using years ago, and you can look it up on the Google webs, right? But it's a FLIR chart, so the forward-looking infrared. And they basically took a picture of like, I don't know, there's a bunch of them now, but there's like 16 or 14 like different emotional states. And they took a FLIR camera and hit those people with the FLIR during those emotional states. And it's crazy because like, like anger or anxiety or depression is all blue because it's cold. Sometimes I'll use that chart with my vets and I'll be like, hey, like, what's it look like for you right now? Because a lot of mostly men can't identify what's happening internally. Like, I know I'm mad, or I know I'm pissed off, or I'm sad, but like, what does that look like in their body? They've never been taught to make that connection. And if you can't make that connection, it's hard to integrate it, right? If we have this cognitive dissonance, if you can't make that connection, you can't really integrate that experience. Right. So I think when you're talking about sitting with it, like that's the importance, I think, of just sitting with it, of like, hey, what is this? Where's it coming from? Where's it hitting me? What do I want to do with it?
Right. Let's finish out. I want to finish out kind of your story, so just kind of go from, okay, you're doing these things, you're kind of getting your eyes open to the possibility of mental health, meditation, whatever else. Where do you go from, or how do you go from that to actually working with other people, right? Like, not only that, I want to do this for a living and help others.
Yeah. And man, if you'd have known me when I was younger, nobody would have guessed this would be the path for me. But
right, but that's what's so cool about it. Again, it's like, I mean, that's a really important message, because people feel like they've got to be locked into some kind of profession, or it's like, well, that's what I am, right? I was a Navy SEAL, and that's what I'll always be, and that's the best thing I ever did. Okay, and it's like, great. I mean, like, you should be proud of that, certainly, and all of that, but it doesn't mean that that's got to be the best thing you ever did. It doesn't mean that's how you have to identify yourself for the rest of your life, right? That's a really important thing for people to understand and get past. So anyway, keep going.
Yeah, no, I think you're right though. Like, recognize that was a part of your life, like figure out how to integrate that part of your life into it. And then, moving on. I think the people who don't integrate that are the ones that get stuck. Right. All right. So I go through treatment, and I realize like treatment is, 6 weeks long, and it's like it's getting a GED in mental health is what treatment's like, right? Like, it's enough to get you out there, but you're going to have to do some work. And so, I had some GI Bill benefits left over. And so as I was going through, I got done with treatment, and I moved into like a veterans home kind of thing that was in Walla Walla. I was like, well, I don't want to go back to mechanicking. And so like, this seems like it's kind of cool. Let me at least milk some VA benefits, right? Because I have my GI Bill. So I started going to school, and it was interesting when I was going to school because I did about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years of my own internal like hardcore therapy. My therapist gave me the best advice I've ever gotten when it comes to that stuff. He's like, man, you got to make sure you take care of your own shit so you can get out of your own way. And that's always stuck with me. And I see therapists now that are compromised internally, and it really messes with the work. That's just an aside. But so I'm going through my own therapy. I'm experiencing my own therapy at the same time as I'm starting to take like these psychology classes, lifespan psychology, all these other like classes, to the soft social sciences. And I'm experiencing them in my own therapy, but then I'm also learning about them cognitively of like, oh, that's why that things happens that you talked about in therapy. So for me, I was getting some breakthrough moments with my therapy. And then I was also getting like some additional information, some like, I wouldn't say like, it was like a higher level of information of like, yeah, this is what's going on with you and this is why, right? So for me, being able to go to school at the same time as I was going through therapy, it was a lot, but it was just like all this good information for me was just coming in, right? And I was just soaking it up. And, it was really me like, hey, I want to give this thing the best shot I can. And I was getting some good results with therapy. I was getting good results from school. And then after I got my associates, Walla Walla University has a really great clinical social work program. I put it in for it. Never in a million years thought I'd get accepted. Nobody in my house went to college. And like 2 weeks later, they're like, hey, you got accepted. I was like, oh, cool. I guess I'm going to college, like for real, like City University. And that when I landed my senior year for my bachelor, it was just straight social work, all the, human dynamics, roles, all that stuff. And at that point, I'd already been doing my own therapy for about 2 years. And I'd really crossed a lot of things off my list as far as like things that were happening internally. And then for me, it was kind of like those hit the ground running. I started doing a work study at the Combat Vet Center. I was just you walk in the door and I was just a greeter. And then as I was going through my senior year, they allowed me to do my practicum there. So kind of like doing some intake stuff as well. And then I ended up doing my internship at the Combat Vet Center as well for my master's degree. And what I noticed is being around veterans, there was such a low barrier of entry for me to socially catch up with them and like integrate with them. It was like this feeling of like, oh, these people get me. Because after I got out especially from contracting, I didn't want anything to do with the military. I didn't want to talk to anybody about the military. Nobody knew I was in the Marine Corps for years. And it was almost like this relighting of this candle of like, oh, yeah, these are some of my people. And I think because I was a Marine as well, there was this barrier for entry for them to be able to actually talk with me as well was lower. And I realized that, like, man, like I love what I'm doing here. This is really, really cool. And I was like slowly just doing a little bit more therapy style work as I was getting closer to my master's degree. And what I was noticing for myself is that I could go into a classroom and they could talk about like, hey, this is what an individual counseling session might look like. And this is how you connect. And I could take that immediately and go right into a session with it. And I could flow with it. And for me, that's when I kind of realized like, oh, like this is what I should be doing. Like the information that I can get, I can take the clinical theoretical information and I can integrate it into a very palatable way for other veterans. Right. And you can just use some really common language and it was easy for me to take that information and then like relay it to get people moving forward in a way that was palatable for them.
Yep.
And if you have a couple successes like that, where, you work with somebody for a couple months and they come back like, hey man, I'm doing this and I'm doing this. Like for me, that was that light bulb of like, okay, so I've spent years like in my own therapy and my own work. And I'm basically taking these resources that are being offered me and I'm using them and I'm integrating them. And to really make this whole thing come full circle, I need to give it back in some way. And for me, being able to do this kind of work is me giving it back in some way. Kind of like repaying a favor, right? Like, hey, somebody was here for me and they did this stuff for me. I have the information now. Let me relay it to you and see if we can kind of light other candles, right?
Yep. So let me ask about the people that come in your office now. Now you have your own practice, right? It sounds like you have a lot of work. Like there's no shortage of work out there for you to do.
No.
Which is the same reason why I'm trying to talk openly about this kind of stuff, because I think it's really important. Is there a common, so when I think about sort of mental health and what I call mind fitness, right? Like the idea of our ability to mentally train ourselves the same way we know how to physically train ourselves for the most part. Like that concept of, I've got these tools now in my tool bag, so to speak, where I can deal with things and I can work at it every day and I can meditate and blah, blah. Is there a common, let's talk about veterans specifically. Is there a big gaping hole in terms of what they know how to do mentally to train themselves, right? Like, is it sort of like, gosh, all these people, and I'm assuming is it mostly men that you treat?
I'm probably 70-30.
Okay. Yeah. Is it like, man, they all just are like this big thing? If they had been taught this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they would be in such, is there something like that?
Yep. Emotional regulation, hands down, not even a close second. Like they just don't know what's happening internally, right? The inability to like regulate the system, dysregulate it. Like they know what dysregulation feels like, but they're like, when you start talking about like, hey man, like, how do you know when you're regulated? And then I realized like, I can't even ask that question because they don't really even know what regulated means or feels like.
I'm not sure I even know what it means. So why don't you back up and kind of break that down a little bit? When you say emotional regulation, what is that?
Yeah. So depending on whatever your emotional state is, like whether that's like happy, angry, sad, enraged, being able to emotionally regulate is to be able to bring that down to a baseline event, right? Or a baseline measurement of like, I'm able to be present in the room. My blood pressure, like you're talking about biological stuff, like blood pressure's down, breathing is normal. We don't have short breaths, able to think logically through a problem. Like you can give them like a word problem. They could actually go through it and be like, all right, this is what this means, right? Because their fight or flight's no longer kind of kicked in. So you're trying to take everything from the amygdala that's in the fight or flight, and you're trying to get it to that prefrontal cortex where all the emotional and reasoning is. That's what you're looking for, right? And a lot of people don't know how to slow that system down and go from like the sympathetic, parasympathetic, right?
Yep.
Like they just don't know how to do that. And if you could do that, and simple stuff like simple, not easy. Breath work is the number one thing that like we always have breath work. If we don't like that, regulation isn't our biggest problem, right? If we don't have our breath. But as long as you have your breath, you can regulate your internal system, right? You may not go down to baseline, you can always regulate the system, period.
So does that start with one sort of recognition of, hey, you got to recognize what's going on here internally and have that objective view, right? That sort of mindfulness awareness of the whole thing. And then to your point, okay, let's inject some tools here, breath work, maybe it's meditation, whatever it may be. And if that's true, are you giving people like a specific breathing technique that you think is really effective, or is it what's that look like?
No, not for me. So like, I tell literally everybody I see this. So like what I believe a good version of like therapy is to kind of move forward is two basic pillars, right? Insight, knowing what's going on, and then perspective. How do we change what we know is going on, right? So insight and perspective are like the big pillars. So when I start with somebody, the first couple sessions are you just getting to know that person, right? What is that person like, right? Does that person like to hang out? Do they like to bowl? Do they like to shoot guns? What is that thing for them? What I really start trying to do is like, hey, can you remember a time when like things are just like calm and you're focused in on what's going on? For some people, that's shooting a gun. That's shooting archery. Some people, that's being on top of a mountain or finishing a hard workout. And so I try to get them some kind of baseline of like, all right, cool. That's what regulation is. That's when you feel the most regulated and dialed in. Okay. What are some things that we can, I mean, you can go on, on Google and you can find 10,000 different ways to like regulate your system. What I really try to do is to get to know that person, try to figure out like, hey, what makes you tick? And then how do we tie in something that would work well with that, right? So if you like to shoot, if you like to shoot guns, like great, cool. Like your breath work's got to be on, especially if you're shooting long rifles. Like your breath work has to be on and steady, or you're never going to hit it, right? And so, however, I can tie who they are into one of those skill sets, that's what I'll do. I never do obviously the one size fits all, but it's a matter of like, how do we tie this into something else? Like some people are like to people watch. All right, cool. If you're dysregulated, we'll do some visual grounding, like pick a picture on the wall and give me the full details of that wall, right? If you're more visually oriented, great. If you're tactile oriented, great. If you want to do breath work, great. We just got to figure out like, hey, what is the thing that you normally are prone to like getting into or you're comfortable around? And then how do we just refine it and tweak that to where you can actually use that as one of your tools to regulate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So that emotional dysregulation or lack of ability to regulate, is that something that happens because of, let me sort of broad question here, but like, does that happen because of the military, you think? Are people drawn to the military that are already prone to that type of behavior in the first place? I also want to throw in one of the things that was a big eye opener for me the more I dove into these types of issues is I think a lot of people out there assume that veterans that are struggling, it's always just like they all have PTSD, right? That's what you always hear. It's like every veteran has PTSD and we're all just sad and like thinking about the things. And that's true for some people, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's a lot more individualized. It's like, yeah, that might be a piece of it. For me, I don't know that I ever had technically PTSD. Mine was more of sort of shame and guilt and regret and that kind of stuff. It wasn't like seeing death. That wasn't what was going through my head. It wasn't that kind of thing. For others, that is true. But then the piece that was a huge eye opener for me was, a lot of people, a lot of veterans, it actually goes back to their, like you, goes back to their childhood. They had some super traumatic childhood. And that may have even been a reason why they went into the military or went into special operations or something like that. So almost like they were going to prove to their father or whoever that it's like, I'm better than you. I'm going to go kick ass. Right. Yep. And then it's like, and then you go through all this traumatic stuff and whatever else it may be. But a huge contributing factor to your mental state as a veteran and why you might be struggling actually goes all the way back till you were 5 years old or something like that, which, man, I never thought that until I started hearing more and more about it and like how many guys are in that same situation.
Yep. Yeah. I would say, and obviously, the people that I see and run into is a little bit skewed because of obviously what I do.
Sure.
But if I had to guess, I would be willing to bet that probably 70 to 80% of the people going into the military are coming in with some pretty difficult, predisposed stuff, right? Lower income, right? People trying to escape their, shitty lives, shitty town. They're trying to get away in some way, trying to prove something in another way. Like that's the Marine Corps' dirty secret, right? We're all a bunch of abused kids who are about to fuck something up, right? Like that's kind of the whole Marine Corps thing. And I think we're probably the worst. The Marine Corps does attract that type of person, right? Prove yourself, right? Like that kind of like thought process. Here's what I'll say about that, man. And I think this is pretty accurate, and hopefully people can conceptualize this. So like, in our early years, like, go ahead down. My dog. In our early years, like, from some people would say from birth, but really like 3, 4, 5 years old until like you're 15 or 16, those are your formative years, right? That's where you learn how to navigate the world, what your sense of self is, your emotional ability to regulate, who you feel you are in the world, your competency, all that stuff, right? Your autonomy. And if you grow up in a really difficult childhood, whether you have like manipulative parents, abusive parents, whatever it is, we all have what I consider like a mental health bucket internally, like, right? Like if something happens, we don't know what to do with it. We're like, yikes, put that back there, right? And the more difficult the childhood, the smaller that bucket is by the time you turn 17, 18 years old. And really that about that time frame, that's kind of the size of your bucket, right? So if you have all these experiences and you have a small little bucket, that thing's like half, 3/4 way full. You have a really difficult couple combat tours in the military, or for some of the women who also have combat tours, but then also the sexual assault stuff. Like, it doesn't take long to fill that bucket, right? So you can have a couple really intense experiences and that bucket's full, right? The flip side is if you have, whatever normal is, but if you have a healthy childhood, loving parents, they're there for you, you're given opportunities, they're supportive, they allow you to be yourself and autonomous. The sense of self really helps you generate like this larger bucket, right? So we can go through more shit a longer period of time. We can put more stuff in that bucket. I say that because a lot of times by the time I see veterans, like they're coming in and like, they'll be like, hey man, I'm watching an ASPCA commercial about a dog and I'm just like weeping in tears. I'm watching a Hallmark movie and I'm weeping in tears. Like, I don't know, what is this, right? And that's kind of the little spiel I give them. Like, hey man, your bucket's full right now.
Yep.
Your body is keeping a score and it's telling you like, hey man, time's up. We're full right now. We got to do something to start emptying that bucket, right? And that's when we start talking about the skills and stuff. But I think across the board, I think that's a pretty good analogy of like how big your bucket is, how much you can actually go, right?
Yep. I've talked about it before. The analogy I use is a Jenga puzzle. It's the same idea kind of in reverse. I haven't talked to you about this. I swear I've mentioned this. I've mentioned it, I think, a few times on the podcast, but for both of you that are listening right now, I'll go over it again. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I came up with this on my own. I don't think I stole it from somewhere else, but I think of it as like a person, like a little kid who's never been through any trauma or anything like that, is a Jenga puzzle, right? Those Jenga towers where it's like you pull the blocks out, that game. And so it's the kind of the opposite idea, but these things happen to you, and instead of filling up a bucket, you're pulling the pieces out. It's like you had some trauma as a kid, you're pulling a piece out. You had some you were in a car accident at some point, pulling a piece out. You got some heavy duty bacterial infection, piece out. Like spent years doing night shift and totally jacked up your circadian rhythm, right? And so these pieces get pulled out. And to your point, and then when people are like, to that point where it's like, hey, I watch a kid's movie with my 10-year-old son and I'm crying during this movie. It's like that Jenga puzzle is like about to collapse, right? And then at some point, whatever it is, this last piece gets pulled and it collapses. And it's like, there you are now. Like you are, and this is what happened to me. Like system completely collapsed. And then what you try to do is you go, maybe if you're lucky, you say, hey, the other day this happened to me and man, I feel so much worse after that. So I'm going to go after whatever that thing is. Sometimes it's like an infection, a virus, a bacteria. It might be a trauma, and you might be able to deal with that. And then you're like, I still don't feel good. Why don't I feel good? And it's like, well, because all the other pieces are still lying on the floor. You now, once you get to that point where the whole system collapses, you've got to go address every single thing that contributed to that. And it's really hard. It's multifaceted. It's like the opposite of an onion. It's like putting the onion back together, right? And that's the trick. Is like, you can put these pieces back up, but like every single one of those, because it's like it pushed over all the pieces that were still in the system too. Like all of that shit is now on the ground too, and that's why it's so hard, I think, right? And I'm still working on it on myself. I probably have 80% of the pieces put back in, but I've still got another like 20% to go, something like that.
Well, I think that's a great analogy. I think that actually a big picture is probably a more apt way to put that than the mental health bucket because of that exact reason, right? Because even though you still have some of these little maybe coping mechanisms, things that are working, like the totality of it, like when it goes, right? Yep. And all that stuff still, like, I think that's a great analogy. And to kind of piggyback on your point there, like I'm still working on my stuff, man. Like they're less and less, but when they do happen, they're like, yikes.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, like this is the message that is so important, right? It's like, I'm not sitting here saying I'm fine. I'm perfect now. Everything is great. And that is how this is the dichotomy of physical and mental health. It's like physical health we all get. It's like spectrum. It's not a yes, no thing. You don't have healthy and unhealthy people physically. We're all on the spectrum. And like, You can move yourself to the right. You can get more fit. You can get more ill. It takes a lot of work. You have to keep doing it the rest of your life. It's never over. But mental health, it's like, well, we go back to just, hey, do you have mental health problems? Are you good? Everything okay? Yeah. And it's like, well, I don't want to say no, because then I'm diseased and I've got an illness and a disorder. So, and then I'm a burden on people, or maybe I'm going to lose my job or something like that. So yeah, I'm good. Right. And so it's like, okay, cool. You're in the no problem bucket. You're in the no problem section. And then it's like, maybe you have the courage to say no. And it's like, okay, now you're in the diseased section of people. And it's just not true. It's like, we're all dealing with stuff that's ongoing. It's like, you're never, just like physical fitness, you're never to the finish line. It's just a question of how disciplined are you and how much work are you going to put in to just keep yourself towards the fit end of the spectrum, and hopefully getting fitter and fitter from a mental standpoint, right? And that's just a really important thing, I think. It's like, there shouldn't be any gurus out there that are like, I am perfectly enlightened and I never get angry and I never get right. Like, I have nothing mentally is ever wrong, ever. It's just bullshit. It's just not true. I think it's really important, right? Like when you're sitting there with a therapist, I think it's really important to know that, hey, the therapist is dealing with their shit too. Mm-hmm. That's really important.
It just shouldn't get in the way, right? Like,
agreed. Yes, of course.
You're right.
Of course. Yep. But like let's say you go to a doctor, right? The doctor has to maintain their own physical fitness as well, their own physical health. And they may have issues. They may have high blood pressure or something like that. It doesn't mean that their advice is erroneous or not valuable, right? You can have a therapist that has to work on themselves. It shouldn't become part of the session, certainly, but that humanizes all of it. Right? To me, that puts us on the same level, and that's why, to me, I always say it's important that we have therapists, people like you out there, obviously, and your story is really important too. That's what's so critical to me, is to hear like that you went through all of that as well, because the sufferers' stories, I think, can be so inspiring. It's just like a transformative story physically. It's like the guy who was 200 pounds overweight and then did the Diamond Dallas Page yoga program or whatever he did.
Yep.
and right. And then steps on this, and now have you ever seen that one of the dude? He's like their poster child to some extent. He was like on sort of walking crutches and could barely walk, and was told he would be like that the rest of his life. And then he just started kind of cleaning up his diet, doing yoga, and then he was sprinting and lost all this. I mean, super inspirational. I don't care who you are. You watch that and you're like, oh, like that's getting me teared up. That's a hard thing to do, though, mentally. Like, it's hard we can see something like that visually. You can see the before and after and the transformative process. I don't even know what that looks like, how you track that mentally. But it is one of the reasons why I say I think journaling is so important, because it's one of the only ways where you can track your mental state day in, day out. You can, if you're just writing stream of consciousness for 15 minutes a day, you can go back and go, okay, this is what I was thinking the last whatever it is, right?
Yeah, the journaling is great. I started doing that at the beginning of the year as well. I know you'd given one of those things out, and I started doing that, and I've enjoyed that as well. I will say that there's like this double-edged sword, right? I guess in kind of a way, when you're talking about like, hey, what does it look like for me to know my mental health or my mental fitness is like kind of on the upswing? And I think for me, one of the things that I like to do, like in sessions, is I'll bring spouses in, right? Like every 6 months or something like that, or sometimes every 3 months or whatever. But I'll bring them in and be like, hey, what do you see with your spouse? And they'll be like, oh, I see this, and this. And I'll bring them back in 6 months later and like, oh, they're not doing this anymore. This thing's kind of happened, but this is kind of falling off the edge. So like, I think one of the good ways that we can monitor that is like the kind of like the friends we keep, right? Like, what are our friends seeing? Like, do we have like these intentional conversations with people? And that's, so the double-edged sword of that is that people, when they tend to have anxiety, depression, panic attack, you name it, PTSD, whatever, like they tend to socially isolate, right?
Yes.
And so for me, that's a big one of like, hey, get out there,
Totally.
make a friend, do something. So like later on down the road when we're like, hey, how are things? Like, I don't know, they're pretty much the same. And your friend's like, no, man, like you're not doing that crazy shit anymore. Like this is happening and this is happening. Like, oh, right. So we need that external input of like, oh, yep, they're telling me and I trust them and I love them. They're telling me this thing. It kind of gives that soundboard a little bit as well.
That's a great point. That's actually something I had not thought of. I mean, I espouse getting together with people and not not isolating. It's healthy and important for so many reasons. But that point is one I hadn't ever thought of. And you're right. It's like you can get that external feedback of someone saying, no, dude, you're like doing a lot better than you were 3 months ago. And that's really validating. And it's so hard to see for yourself, right?
Yeah. Because it's the day in, the day out stuff. And some people rely on their therapist to do that stuff. And I'm like, they can do that, right? But like, that's not your friends. Those aren't your homies, your hangouts. Like, we're kind of trained to look at that stuff and be like, oh, hey, this is happening different. But if you're talking about like quality of life, and therapy is like a tenth of the sliver of the pie of like things we should be doing. Some of that is social interaction, is having those friendships, right? Allowing those people to kind of love on you and kind of grind off those crunchy edges that you're like, maybe I don't want to do that anymore because I really like this person. And every time I do that, it's not taken well. Cool. All right. It helped, friends help us kind of like mold and meld that stuff. Absolutely invaluable.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the first responder community, because you mentioned that. I'm curious as to the interplay or the interconnectedness of that community and veterans, because the reason I started what I do is because I wanted to reach primarily the veteran community, at least as my sort of target. Yep. But realizing that there's a lot of these tangential communities or ones that would, in a Venn diagram, would overlap to some extent. And I'm just curious what that community is like. How much of it is, I guess, the same from a broad brush perspective as the veteran community? How much is different? Do they deal with things in a slightly different way? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah. So, dude, if you had 100 veterans and 100 law enforcement and they didn't have uniforms on, you probably wouldn't know the difference. Okay. And that goes for their culture. That goes for the way in which they talk to each other as far as like their own mental health. Like there is such an easy page flip from veterans to the law enforcement. Because, most law enforcement, especially in small town like, Montana, right? Like a majority of your police are former military in some capacity. And that culture is, I would say, it is more ingrained in the current law enforcement culture to not talk about what's going on than it is even in the veteran community. I think it's actually got a little bit more of a negative stronghold than our veteran community, because there are so many people like you and I and others that are kind of talking about these things on these platforms and kind of, preaching a little bit of like, hey, like we got to do something about this. Very few people in the law enforcement community are doing that, right? Like they do their thing, they go through all their stuff and then they retire and then they just like fade away. Not a lot of people are coming out about that stuff. That being said, I would say, day for day, month by month, year by year, the police are going through considerably more trauma than veterans ever will. I mean, they're in their local community. They have, think about like responding to like, things with children and car accidents and shootings in your hometown, right? So when you're off work and you go by this place where you just had to do CPR on a baby yesterday and your wife's freaking out, same thing, right? Yep. So like they're never removed from the stimulus. Like Iraq is really far. Afghanistan is really far. Africa is really far. And in a sense, we get to at least not be in that stimulus trigger. Yeah, we may have trash on the road or, all that, those little triggers, but the day-to-day, for the most part, like the police are in it.
Yeah, man, that's such a great point. I had never focused on that, but you're totally right. The trick, I think, in the military, or what became tricky was, I've talked about before, warfare, at least from let's call it the last couple 100 years. I guess a civil war would be different, but World War II as an example. Those guys, they went to war, off to war, and they basically were either coming back or not, and they were gone until the war was over. It was a couple years, whatever it may be, for the most part. Vietnam, there were tours, but still, it was kind of like, I don't know how long those guys were over there for, months, maybe years, whatever. It may have come back, but these last 20 years has been this like gone back. I mean, for decades, right? Which is such a different thing. It's like you would have to get yourself into warfare mindset, literally combat. And then, well, here's the other thing too. Times like World War II, okay, you were over there for how long? And then it took a long time to get back. You were on like a boat going across the Atlantic Ocean. Nowadays, it's like, hey, you're going to get on a plane, you're going to take some Ambien, you're going to sleep for 24 hours. Basically, you're there in combat, and then you're going to, right? So you're literally going straight from the combat sort of circadian rhythm dysregulated situation to, hey, I'm back with my family, and it's all good. We're going to go to, Bed Bath and Beyond, maybe Home Depot. I don't know if I'll have time, whatever.
Time.
Yeah. And to try to like flip that switch back and forth is a really abnormal thing. I just don't think we are like sort of conditioned properly to be able to do that. But however, to your point, at least those two situations are separated from one another geographically. As much as like people might carry some of it back with them and might get into hypervigilance and hyperarousal and whatever else may be going on. But you're right. If you're a cop or a firefighter, there's no geographic separation from wherever the trauma and combat, so to speak, happens and where you live. And that's harsh. I hadn't thought about it that way. You're totally right.
Yeah, and I started seeing like several cops who were police officers, or several police officers who were veterans when I was at the Combat Vet Center, and then also at the VA. And when I started seeing them, I was just like, "Oh man, you have, even 3-4 combat tours, right? You're talking about a couple years overseas at combat tours." Like as I was talking to them, I was noticing they're like, yeah, this happened. I had a couple of these things happen, and all right, cool. We can check out those things. We'll look at them. And then there's like, yeah. And then I had a hit and run the other day that I'd go through, and there was a shooting, and then there was a plane crash that happened. And like, oh, well, how was that? Well, that was last week. Whoa. Right. And so for me, and the culture is so similar and so close. For me, like that was really one of my pressing things to get out of the VA. Cause like, I have a nonprofit in the community here that I run, and I try to I want my community to be healthy, so we're all healthy, right? And I noticed hey, the people who are protecting our community, they're struggling right now. Nobody's helping them; they can't help themselves. And so for me, I wanted to get out of the VA, broaden my horizons, spread my wings a little bit, and put some work into this community because it's so close, man. It's the same Warriors mentality, but they're not getting help, man.
And I have a couple questions. One is, what's the predominant thing that they deal with? Is it the same thing? Is it emotional dysregulation?
It's moral injury stuff, man.
Okay. So dive into that. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So with PTSD, so PTSD, a lot of when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, you're dealing with combat situations, a lot of violence that either you're perpetrating or it's coming back and forth. With moral injury, and I think this is across the board really with law enforcement or first responders, it's basically witnessing or being around events that basically transgress your ethical or moral code, right? And you have to just see it. Seeing a baby get shot, seeing a baby get drowned, watching a woman get beat, right? We have these internal markers of our values and our ethics, hey, this should never happen, this should never happen. And then we're witnessing it daily, right? We call that, it's like a moral injury, internally, your morals are being basically kind of shredded. Mm-hmm. And so I would say the majority of law enforcement, that's the issue. When I first started coming on board with Flathead County Sheriff's Office, talking with the sheriff, undersheriff, and some other people, I mean, almost across the board, probably 98% of the guys were like, hey, I felt justified. We're talking about a shooting, right? That was their original critical incident. Hey, they shot at us. We returned fire. We were protecting our lives, the lives of other. I'm good with that. That's my job. I'm okay with that. I didn't know I was going to have to walk into a room and there was a dead baby on the floor that's been there for 5 hours, right? Like that kind of stuff is the stuff that's really been tweaking them. And so for me, I've been trying to work with like Flathead County, Polson, even Glacier National Park, who those guys go through crazy amounts of trauma, body recoveries, moral injury stuff, working with those communities to set up some programs of like, hey, what is a critical incident? In the past, it's always been defined as like a shooting. Most of your cops don't have a problem with the shooting because they're defending their life, right? Like, hey, I'm justified. And so I've been working with them to try to figure out like, all right, what is a critical incident as far as mental health goes, right? And the point of that is to make sure that we can define critical incidents in a couple different ways that actually directly revolves around a moral injury that's happened, right? Seeing death of women, children, stuff like that. And so you can actually address that problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, but how do you do that? I mean, what's the approach there? Okay. You're going to, because here's the reality, right? Like if you're in that job, you're going to see some of this stuff. So it's like, it's part of the job. So what is the process there? Like to kind of get through it?
Yeah. So what I'm doing right now is I am starting from the ground floor up and I am creating that process. So what that really looks like, what I'm doing right now is I am going in front of the officers, first responders, and I'm starting to give like education, open up the conversation of like, hey, PTSD isn't you in the corner skinning the cat, right? It's being distant from your spouse. It's yelling at your kids more than you would like to. Little things like that, right? It's you socially isolating from people. It's you being hypervigilant. It's me trying to educate them so they can see these things coming on earlier, so I don't get them by the time they're at the, by the time the Jenga piles already fell, right? So some education, and then also creating an internal structure of like, hey, when this type of event happens, like your guys need to go see somebody. Whether you think it's a big deal or not, like if this kind of incident happens, this triggers like an internal event of like, oh, this is a thing that happened. This falls into the moral injury category. We think it does. So we're going to automatically we're going to at least just check in with one of your guys. And then also some of that is me getting baselines for officers as they're coming into from the academy and into law enforcement. Like, hey, like I'm going to give you like I'm going to give you like PTSD scales, depression scales, anxiety scales. I'm going to ask you about your social stuff. Just kind of like a broad intake of like who you are as a person right now. Mm-hmm. We're going to check in every 6 months, and see how you're doing. Take some of these again. Where are you at on this stuff, right? And I think you need to develop close personal relationships. So when you see them, they're not pencil whipping that shit. That's the kind of the trick, right?
Yep,
and so
yep.
That is like me and some of the people that I'll be hiring with me to have very close personal relationships. So you can have some conversations, or they can call and be like, hey, this is a thing that happened, man. It was 2 weeks ago. It's still bothering me. Like, can I come chat with you for a minute? Yep. Come on down, man. We'll take care of it.
Yeah.
Right? Creating those personal relationships and some insight from them of like, hey, this is a thing that's happening. I don't like to talk to people anymore, right? So they know what the beginning stages of some of these issues are. So then it prompts them of like, this isn't the way I used to be 6 months ago. Maybe I should just, have a conversation.
Yeah. To me, so much of that comes down to like, this is where training helps. Prior training, realizing, hey, in your role, we hope that you never see these types of things, but the reality is you probably are. You're going to see these things. That's part of the job. So it's preparation for that. And then it's, hey, when this happens, you're going to have the memory of that. You're going to remember that. But be very, very careful of the story you start telling yourself about that. And that's what you really need to clue into. And that was something that I had come to terms with, of like my trauma that I dealt with it wasn't really the trauma. It was the story I told around it. That was the problem, right? And that's understanding that. It's like, you need to, if you start telling yourself a story, you need to recognize that. And if it's a destructive story, you need to stop that in its tracks. Understand why you're doing that, and then probably change the story. That's really important. Realizing you don't have to tell that destructive story. And I speak from experience here. I told a destructive story to myself for 12 years about my own kind of traumatic experience, And once I stopped doing that, the trauma of it basically went away.
Yep.
It's like I can still remember it. Yeah, it just doesn't bother me anymore.
Yeah. I think that's the trick, right? It is always the story we tell ourselves, right?
Yeah, totally.
And if we don't know how to process that and we can't make sense of it, then we usually tell the worst possible story, right? We have this internal sense of like, oh, if something bad happened, it must have been my fault or I had something to do with it. And so we just basically put our emotional blanket around everything, like, oh, all of that was my fault. Like, you had a role to play, dude, but like you didn't have that much to do with it. And just seeing the clarity of what actually happened, right? Like the truth of the situation versus what I'm telling myself.
Yep.
If you're talking about trauma, most of the time that doesn't really align.
Yep. One other thing I want to get your take on with cops, and that is with the military. I mean, we're in a pretty good state societally now in the sense that regardless of where you might fall in the political spectrum, there's a pretty unified support of the troops, so to speak. People might not agree with the actual wars fought or conflicts or any of that, but like by and large, there's very few people out there going, screw the troops, right? It's very much, it's supportive. We have a supportive culture of veterans, of people in the military by and large. Cops, on the other hand, right now are getting a ton of negative energy. And that's not to say that there aren't bad apples out there, certainly, and people that obviously should be prosecuted or whatever it may be, right? However, that's being extrapolated to like all cops deserve this critique. So, I mean, like to me, it's just another, man, that's just got to be so difficult if you're a police officer now, right? It's like, hey, I'm just doing my job here. I'm already to the point we were just talking about. I deal with this stuff and it's in my backyard. I can't get away from it. And now I've got this message being directed at me that I'm just, because I'm a cop, I'm evil and I'm bad and all of that. And I just think that that has to add to all of this, right?
Yep.
So how does that, do you get a lot of that? Do you get people coming in there just like, man, like, it's hard to hear all the negative energy that's being directed at me and my coworkers and.
Yeah. So luckily we're in Northwest Montana, right? We're still pretty supportive by and large of law enforcement.
Yes.
So and I would say we may not actually be the norm, right? We're really lucky in this area where it's funny too. And I tell the guys sometimes like, hey, don't do that. But they do it still. It's like they watch the news, right? And and they're like, oh, this cop over here in Missouri and this cop over here in New York. I'm like, yeah, it sucks. It's not right. But like, that has nothing to do with you right here. Like you're in a good department. You have people, but a lot of people will get themselves worked up, right? Because it is a brotherhood. And I understand that. But that piece needs to be taken care of on its own, right? So like I think people can get themselves worked up in our area and with some legitimacy, right? Like I get it. We don't want that stuff to spill over. But I'd, really take care of your house first before we start figuring out like what's going on with the neighborhood. And we're pretty fortunate here for the most part. It's getting a little bit more different over the last couple of years with all the influx of people from different states that have more liberal views, I think, than conservative, because this has obviously traditionally been a very conservative state. So that's it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good point. I stopped watching the news a couple of years ago, I think, where I'm like, this is not helpful, right? No. And I think that's something we all succumb to, which is we take messaging that's out there societally, nationally, and we bring it home. It's like, and we even say like, even that kind of stuff, we bring up a good point. It's like, man, all this negative dialogue about police officers. And it's like, well, if you turned off all the national news, would you really be getting any of that messaging? Is it like, are people in your own community doing that? And if not, why bother listening to the national narrative on this stuff, right? I mean, and this applies to everything, political, you name it. Or even, I was thinking about with the fact that you treat or talk with primarily men too. I mean, if you kind of go on the national scale, you can extrapolate a lot of sort of negative talk about men these days too, right? Toxic masculinity, right? The idea that just because you're a man, you're toxic or you're evil almost, right?
Right.
And I'm guilty of that sometimes too, of like internalizing that, or I'll read something that sort of leans that way. But I have to kind of check myself a little bit and be like, yeah, but does anybody around me act that way? Right? Does my family act that way? No. Do my coworkers? No. Like nobody in my community acts that way. So like, why am I getting wrapped up in that narrative? I'm not saying it's not out there.
Yep.
But it's like, why make it part of my life when it isn't? Right? And there's
100%.
so much of that too. Like so much messaging that we can get it instantaneously through the internet, through social media, and we internalize it and make it personal. We make it about us. And it's like none of it is directed at you. And you wouldn't even know about it if you just interacted with the people that were actually part of your life, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's funny too. I stopped watching the news.
No. It's like one of the best things you can do for your mental health. Just stop.
Like 4 or 5 years ago, and I'll have vets come, and this is usually the older vets still, like Vietnam era, like mid 50s to mid 75s. They'll come and be like, "Hey, did you see what's going on in the news?" And I always tell them, like, "Dude, I don't watch the news. I have no idea what's going on." And they're usually like, "Oh, like I have no context for it, man. Sorry." One, because I don't want to talk about it, right? Because there's no good will come of that other than me basically reframing it and being like, "Hey, how is that actually affecting you?"
Yep.
Right? And they're like, "Oh, it's not." I'm like, all right, cool, let's stop doing it. But basically, I'll just be like, "Hey, man, I don't watch the news. Like, I don't have any context for what's going on. I don't know if the Kardashians are on TV. I couldn't tell you. Sorry, man."
Yep.
My train sailed. So
I call it anger porn. It's like right. It's like and I mean, I think that is the appropriate term for it. It's like, oh yeah, okay, sit down, ready to get angry. Here we go. Boom. Yep. Turn on the news, right? And it's like you're addicted to being angry, kind of, to some extent. It's like that you're getting off on just whipping yourself into a frenzy every day. And you got to sit there and go, why am I doing this? Like, how does this serve me? And it gets back to a point I made earlier. It's like, well, maybe it's because you are angry, but it's not about that. It's something else. And that's really what you should probably dig into, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It's a surrogate for it's right.
100%. Yeah. And it kind of, our internal, if we're engaging in something externally that reflects our internal state, like that stuff vibes, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, if I'm feeling angry and I'm watching angry shit, like cool, like I'm in my path, like I'm doing the thing that makes me happy, right?
Yeah.
And it makes me angry.
Well, and it can be, it's comfortable. You can get comfortable like that, where, 100%. You talk about the emotional dysregulation. I mean, man, when I got out of the military, I definitely had that I can remember situations where I flew off the handle. I don't even remember what it was about, but I can remember standing in my kitchen arguing with my wife about something trivial, I'm sure. And I took off my like $200 pair of sunglasses and I smashed them on the floor. And that was, you want to talk about emotional lack of ability to regulate. There it is, right there, right? And this is something, again, I have no idea now what the hell it was about. I guarantee it wasn't all that important, right? But there's a comfort in that to some extent, I think. And it's like, great, I'm just going to keep being angry because that's what I'm used to. And I'm comfortable there. And it can be uncomfortable to analyze ourselves and look at what's really causing that, right? Yeah, and I think back on those, man, it's embarrassing. But it's funny too. I guarantee she doesn't even remember. Like nobody remembers it but me. And again, like, so that's destructive too for me to wallow. Yeah, nope. Nobody remembers it but you. Nobody cares. Like, so you might want to not carry it too. All right. Well, I got to wrap this up in a couple minutes. Anything else that we didn't touch on I think that's relevant to what you do that might be really important to the veteran community, first responder community, anybody else who might be listening out there?
No, not specifically, man. But here's what I'll say though. Like, I think when did I meet you? 2017? Yeah, it had been
18. We moved here at 18, yeah.
Okay. So shortly after I moved here. So it's been interesting to watch your journey, man. Like, especially when I first met you, like you were still going through a lot of your stuff. And then obviously I've been following your blog and then your podcast and then some of the book reads and stuff. One of the things that I would say, if people are looking to self-improve in some way, is one of the beautiful things that I think that you've been doing is like this consistently pushing for discovery, right? I don't think there's like any one thing in general. Like I would never be like, oh, you need to do this, or you go therapy, or you got to do breath work, or whatever, right? Even though all those things are helpful. Like one of the things that has been really impressive is for me to like, from kind of like this outsider's perspective, is see you like go through these things, challenge yourself, and like in a way, it's like you're modeling for other people, like what that can look like. And so for me, man, I just wanted to say like kudos for that, because I know that you've basically just been doing all your own like deep dive stuff and be like, hey, well, what is this about? Take the rabbit hole. Like so many of the things that you've talked about in this podcast right here, and in some of your other ones, which have been really great, is like you've done these journeys of self-discovery, and you've, some of them worked really well, and some of them like, that doesn't work great. A lot of those things that you've been doing, like we do in a therapeutic environment, right?
Yeah.
Which is fine. But I think there's probably a greater value in us self-discovering those things and taking ourselves down that road than just relying on just like the therapeutic piece, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what I talk about is like a therapist is a personal trainer for your mind. It's like they should be teaching you how to do these things on your own. But eventually, I mean, it's great. If you love your therapist and you just want to talk to them every week, that's great. But really, they should be working themselves out of the job.
100%.
Right? It's like, and that's not, I don't think that should be controversial to say. The same way a physical trainer should work themselves out of the job. It's like, hey, I've taught this person what I know about how to work out. Now, maybe they still lack the discipline to do it every day, and that's a little bit of a crutch for them. Okay, that's fine. But they should know everything they really need to know at some point. And it's just a matter of, applying it to what they do. And the self-discovery piece, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, is like, so you're empowered. You have so much power to kind of do this on your own. And to your point, it is a bespoke thing. Like the concept is the same for everybody, but what works for me is not exactly the same as what's going to work for you or somebody else. And it's like, no one can sit there and say, okay, here's the exact formula of how to become mentally fit. Nope, that just doesn't exist. It's like, you got to find your own path and try things. And something that might have been like the heart opening thing you did, right?
Mm-hmm.
That may be that was super powerful for you. It might not work at all for somebody else. Yep. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that it wasn't effective for you. And it doesn't mean, and it can be, I think those discoveries can be good as well, because you go, okay, that didn't work. Like, great, let's cross that off the list. Let's give it our all. That's really important. It's very important that it's like, don't half-ass it. Like, I'm big on, okay, do your quote unquote research and try something and really try it. Give it your best shot. And that way you can properly evaluate it. You can say, this is really effective. I like this. I'm going to incorporate this into my daily, weekly practice. Or, no, it didn't really work for me. Or, I kind of liked it, whatever it may be. Man, I found that time and time again with things. I know people that have done things that are like, man, this was so profound and impactful, and I'll try it. And I go, like, yeah, and vice versa, and that's just like, that's part of the deal. We're all different, All right, cool, man. Well, like I said, I got to bounce, but there are some other things that we didn't get to that I want to talk to you about. So we can reserve that for part 2, the return, at some point.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, for sure, man.
Cool. Where can, if somebody wants to connect with you or find out more about you, where can they do that?
So let's see. You can reach out on my email. I have a website, but it's through my electronic healthcare record. If you just Google Brandon Spangler, my company is Warriors Mindset LLC. If you just Google Warriors Mindset LLC with Brandon Spangler, it'll come up with
awesome.
All my information. But I'm here locally in Kalispell.
Awesome. And I should say, you're the only person with a Ghostbusters last name that I've ever met in my entire life. I don't know a Venkman, I don't know a Zettermore, and I don't know a Stance, but I know a Spangler, and that's really exciting.
You're welcome.
All right, brother, we'll end there. Good talking to you. Really appreciate it.
All right, brother.